Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm your CAD president, Kavita Pipalia. I'm very thrilled to have Tom Holcomb with us this evening. His topic is deaf-centered interpreting, making the interpreting experience better for everyone. Before we start with Tom's presentation, I'd like to set up some ground rules for this evening. First, we're all going to watch Tom's presentation completely. When it's over, we will have a period where we will show some upcoming events, a short video on that, and then we will have an opportunity for a question and answer period. You have a choice during this time. If you would like to ask your question in ASL, we have two people behind the scenes, Ming Chen and Sharon Goff, who are going to be screening the questions. And at that time, you need to let them know whether you would prefer to ask your question through text or through ASL signed. If it's through text, we will shadow sign your text to Tom. And then Tom will answer your question. We will have to filter the questions for appropriateness and relatability. We do have two interpreters working with us this evening, Aaron and Dan. They will be voicing for Tom and also signing if any of you would prefer to ask your question in spoken English. We will then spotlight the interpreter and the interpreter will sign the question. So without further ado, I hope you all really enjoy Tom's wonderful presentation this evening. We're so thrilled to have you here, Tom. Thank you so much for coming and joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Kavita. It's my great pleasure to be here with you this evening as part of CAD's presentation series. I've been very impressed with CAD's work under Kavita's leadership. It's just been so impressive, and they have a great group of folks working together, keeping the community informed, hosting webinars, and so many other things. And I'm thrilled to have the chance to share my work with you this evening, particularly as it pertains to something we're calling deaf-centered interpreting. And you might wonder just what that is. It's a way we're pursuing to make the interpreting experience for everyone involved. As deaf people, we've long felt there's something lacking in interpreting services, but we haven't been able to put our fingers on what the problem was. At NAD conferences, at CAD conferences, at RID conferences, we've seen more and more discussion from deaf people that interpreters are simply not responsive, not listening to deaf people and the needs they have from interpreting services. It doesn't mean that the interpreters are incompetent, but there is something missing. And we've been talking about how we might go about finding a solution so that the interpreter's work would be actually meeting the needs of deaf people. I'll share with you my thoughts on that, the work I've done on that, and the goals we have to engage in further dialogue to better define how the work of interpreters can truly meet the needs of us, the deaf community. I'll also talk about how we can all be involved in that. I'm a professor at Ohlone College in Fremont, California, and have been for now 30 years. Ohlone, as you know, has a very large program for deaf students. We have a Deaf Studies division, which has 4 components. We have the Deaf Department, which means direct education of deaf students. And we have about 100 deaf students who participate in that program. Also, we have the ASL department, obviously teaching American Sign Language for any students who'd like to learn it. Thirdly, we have the IPP, the Interpreter Preparation Program, so that those students can develop their skills to become interpreters. And fourthly, we have the Gallaudet Regional Center, which represents the western states of the United States. We have a great group of people working together. We're all in the same building, and so we have that synergy working off of each other. When I joined 30 years ago, the interpreting program was taught entirely by hearing instructors. The deaf teachers focused on the deaf program exclusively, well, that and the ASL program. But we left the interpreting program to the hearing faculty members. The hearing faculty would, from time to time, ask us to visit class to give a 1-hour presentation or something. It was very minimal, though. And that's how it was for very many years as the interpreter preparation program graduated a large number of students. And we didn't really think that there was anything wrong with that because it was the norm at the time. But eventually, the interpreting teachers wanted deaf faculty involved to a greater extent. But we were a little uncertain about that because we didn't know anything about teaching interpreters. But the interpreting faculty were insistent. They asked me to teach a class, and I thought, well, I don't know the first thing about teaching an interpreting skills class, but we did participate more and more. And I taught 3 classes, and at this point now I've become the chair of the interpreting program. It's a bit of a head scratcher how all that came to pass, but what we've come to realize that deaf people should be in leadership in interpreting programs. Interpreting teachers have always asked us, what makes interpreters successful for you? And people have inquired of NAD members what it means to have an appropriate attitude as an interpreter. Well, obviously, we want interpreters who have language skills, who both understand sign and sign very well. But that was often as far as we could get because we couldn't put our fingers on the rest of it. I've reflected a lot on my own experience of using interpreters in a variety of settings, in educational settings, including when I pursued my master's degree and my PhD at university level. I would use interpreters throughout. I now work at a mostly hearing university, and so I again use interpreting services quite a bit. But I found that my experiences were not unique. If you could move to the next slide, please. Perhaps this looks familiar to you. These reactions that deaf people often have when participating in a hearing event through interpreters. You often feel disengaged, bored, not interested in the information as you're receiving it. In a meeting held all in ASL, I'm a completely different person. I'm very animated and very involved in the discussion, but if I'm the only deaf person in an otherwise hearing event, this is what I end up being like. I just can't wait for it to be over. It doesn't mean that the interpreter is not qualified. We have good interpreters, but it just feels like there's something missing, and it makes me feel disengaged. And I do feel bad for interpreters. I know that some interpreters work very hard. If you could move to the next slide, please. These images are meant to represent interpreters who are working hard, doing their best, trying to use the language to its fullest, to be animated, only to have the deaf person responding in the way I showed you on the previous slide. And that can be disheartening to interpreters. What's to be done? Is that just the way it is? Are the hearing world and the deaf world simply too different, and that this is the best we can hope for? Is it the interpreter's fault? We have so many questions. Next slide, please. First, we should start off from where we are. Interpreting, if you encounter it at a conference, you have to seek out the interpreter for a moment. Interpreting has long been focused on what we call message equivalency, receiving a message, say, in spoken English, and seeking to create the message in ASL that will be equivalent in meaning. Interpreters have spent a lot of time focusing on this technical aspect of interpreting, say, in an interpreter lab. And when they achieve it by whatever measure, they are rewarded, even if the deaf person doesn't understand what's been signed, and that often has been the case. Deaf people then don't feel like they can participate in because they have no access. They can't participate in class. They can't feel that they truly understand what they're there to understand. Pardon me. They can't have appropriate access. So obviously that's not sufficient. Message equivalency alone does not make interpreting effective. It doesn't give deaf people the access that they need to opportunities for interaction and dialogue with their hearing peers, or simply to the information. Another issue has to do with intent versus impact. Many interpreters have the best of intentions to generate interpretations that are on the money and effective. Often interpreters work in teams where the support interpreter is monitoring and providing support if the target interpreter has missed any of the incoming message. But again, the focus is on the language. As we know, though, intent and impact often lose sight of each other. Has the deaf person truly understood? Have they had access to full participation? Or do they feel disengaged? The interpreting team are focused on each other, on the work product being generated, but not on the deaf person's experience of the event. the deaf person doesn't feel like they're at all connected to the interpreting team in that way. And although the team has the best of intentions, we have to question the impact because it can turn out to have an oppressive impact. How to address this isn't immediately clear. So, how to resolve these issues of access and deaf people's opportunities for full participation? This has been a huge issue, but one of the things we've noticed is that the solutions being offered are interpreter based. They're not deaf centered. Deaf people sometimes are part of the conversation, but we deaf people haven't had a chance on our own to discuss what it is that makes interpreting effective for us. In the last 5 to 10 years, I've been seeking out those solutions that come from within the deaf community. And I published this book, Deaf Eyes on Interpreting. I interviewed 30 deaf people across the country to try to seek out new perspectives, a fresh take on how we deaf people feel that interpreting can allow us to participate fully in those situations where we use interpreters. So I hope that this compilation will be helpful in getting interpreters to provide service in a way that is most effective in the way that deaf people define effectiveness. Also, another project of mine is a sign of respect. We focus on what it is that deaf people want from the interpreting experience. I asked 100 deaf people across the country about different scenarios and how they would like to see them handled. I collected their opinions of what they hope interpreters would understand about what's important to deaf people so that the interpreting service provided will be maximally effective. I have some examples I can share with you about what we mean by deaf-centered interpreting. Next slide, please. We know that skill level varies greatly among interpreters. We've seen the advent of team interpreting over the years, which might just be seen as a chance for interpreters to switch on and off. One interpreter might be very effective, but when they switch, the next interpreter might be providing you 20 minutes of agony because you can't follow them at all until the first interpreter comes back. How might we solve such a situation? There hasn't been a solution. Typically, whatever the interpreters decide in terms of their time period for switching on and off is all there was to do. Another scenario involves very fast-paced meetings where the back and forth is done primarily through interrupting and overlapping each other. Often interpreters don't know how to handle that, and then the deaf person feels left out. Even good interpreters are often at a loss for how to handle that setting. Sometimes all there is to say is that we're sorry, that's the best we can do. There must be a better solution, though. Here's another scenario. Let's say that I'm presenting, perhaps in a workshop or in a classroom, more likely a workshop, and perhaps the interpreter misunderstands what I've said or misinterprets what I've said. And it isn't until after the fact that a hearing friend who I consider an ally might say to me, that interpreter didn't do a good job. And that's a little too late for me. Some allies will speak up in the moment. They'll say, the speaker did not say that. But interpreters respond angrily. Who are you to interrupt me while I'm working? I'm doing my job here. Ego can get in the way. In any event, it's an awkward situation because no one is absolutely certain what to do. Next slide, please. Sometimes a hearing presenter will turn to the interpreter and ask if they're going too fast for the interpreter. And often the interpreter will say, no, I'm right there with you. And they have their moment, and then the speaker goes back to speaking just as quickly and the interpreter to signing just as quickly. But maybe they were too fast for me as the deaf person. Just because the interpreter can keep up doesn't mean that their product is understandable to the deaf person. Next item, please. It's often like we've been fixed up on a blind date when we go someplace and meet a new interpreter. Maybe it'll be a medical appointment, and we often don't get confirmation of who it's going to be, and so we just cross our fingers and hope we're going to get a good one that day. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we don't. We usually don't know who's going to show up. It's the luck of the draw. Next. After the appointment is finished, or whatever other meeting it is, and as we leave, I might want to double check something with the interpreter. Now, did they close it saying that the meeting is going to be, the follow-up is going to be next week or in 2 weeks? Interpreters often respond that, well, I can't really answer that question, but I'd be happy to interpret that question for you if you'd like to go back inside. But for such a simple thing, I don't necessarily want to do that. How can we better handle such situations? Agencies are the ones who determine which interpreter should be sent to any given assignment. I, as a deaf person, not only don't have any input into who I'd like to have, I don't even get their names once they've been selected. I may get a name, but then not know if that person's going to be any good for me or not. These are all very common experiences that deaf people shared in our survey. The typical response to all of these is, well, that's just the way it's been. However, deaf-centered interpreting offers a brand new lens on these situations. I'd like to share with you what that might entail. First of all, it's not just to do things the way they always have been. I don't suggest that what I'm offering you are the best practices, but it's opening up the doors to thought about these things that we've taken for granted. It isn't just the way it's always been, and that means it's the way it has to be. We want to improve interpreting services both for deaf people and for interpreters as well. Interpreters want to do their best. They want to have a peak experience where they provide good quality service. So we have some suggestions. Back to that first scenario where one interpreter is doing a really good job for you, but the other not so much. What might be a deaf-centered solution for that? Sometimes I'll discuss with that qualified interpreter who says there's not much I can do because they're switching off every 20 minutes. Sometimes I'd like the more qualified interpreter to stay on longer, maybe take a longer shift than the other, but then there's this idea of fairness that seems to take priority in the interpreter's process. Here in the Bay Area, everyone's nuts over Steph Curry, right? He's the star of the Warriors, and we can't get enough of him. He's the star player. Can you imagine if he just played for 20 minutes and then sat down for 20 minutes because he had to give other players a fair chance, even if the other players weren't any good, or at least not suited to that particular moment of the game? Of course not. Curry stays in as long as he can, maybe until he's tired, until he needs a break or needs some water, at which point subs are brought in. And he does what he needs to do to feel back up to par and then get back in the game. Should interpreters work the same way? If you have a real mismatch in skill level between interpreters, should the more skilled interpreter work a little bit longer? Of course, they're going to need to have a break. They're going to need to let another interpreter take over for a time, but does it have to be evenly divided? I may check with the more qualified interpreter and ask if they need to take a break at 20 minutes. Sometimes they feel that they could continue, but just because the norm is so deeply ingrained in the interpreting process, that 20-minute switch still happens. We want to consider what works most effectively for the deaf consumer while respecting the interpreter's need to get appropriate breaks. We just don't want to be tied to this rigid notion of every 20 minutes and that the time shifts have to be the same number of minutes in order to be equitable. That does not serve the deaf consumers well. In fast-paced meetings, how might that better be handled? We have one interpreter trying to represent all of the hearing people around the table just through their two hands. Perhaps we could use the resources we have to better effect by having both interpreters on at the same time. Maybe one interpreter could interpret the comments of the group leader or the teacher, while the other interpreter could interpret for other comments made by other participants. And that way, I'll actually see conversations happening before me, just as they are happening in the room. When one interpreter has to do everything, the interpreter often has to take a little more control than I'd like them to of the session by interrupting and asking people to speak one at a time, making the vibe less lively than people might like it to be. Also, if one interpreter is trying to interpret everything, the product that I get to watch is just way too busy. And there's also no opportunity for me to participate because the floor is never open at a time when I'm able to get it. Also, another model is where the support interpreter is focused on me and is ready to speak up in the second that I want to speak up, before the first signing interpreter has had a chance to finish what they're signing. That lets me get a word in edgewise. And now on to where the interpreter is making mistakes. Even the best interpreters make mistakes. They might miss something. They may not be familiar with an acronym. And getting an unsolicited feed from someone who's not part of the interpreting team can be disconcerting for them. But if the mistakes are not corrected, that reflects poorly on the deaf person, and they don't even know what's going on, perhaps. What should an ally who's part of the audience do? It is indeed awkward. People feel bad in those situations, but they don't know what to do. The ally wonders, should I move forward and sort of insert myself in the interpreting team? Should I just speak out? Should I get the deaf presenter's attention and just through sign let them know something's going on so they can take care of it? Well, a potential solution might be by having a pre-meeting with the interpreter in which the ally would take part. I might do that, say, with a coworker who often attends the same meetings I do, who knows my work, who's in the same field as I am, and I would introduce them to the interpreters so they'll know who that person is. And I can let them know that if at some point the interpreting team misses something or starts to go off track a little bit, this is who will be helping you out. They may come down and be with you in the front of the room. They may just give you a feed from where they're seated. I learned about this from Larry Fleischer, a professor at Cal State University Northridge, who unfortunately passed away. He always had the experience of feeling uncertain about attending meetings if he didn't know who the interpreter was going to be. Typically, he went to meetings where he was the only deaf person, and the ally he had was Joyce Linden. He would often just have her do the interpretation of his signed comments into spoken English. The working interpreters would still be there to sign from English into ASL, and he would do the best he could in understanding them. But he didn't want to take that gamble of relying on them to interpret his comments. And so he relied on Joyce Linden. That was their deal. And that was such a paradigm shift for me. I had been so polite, just letting the interpreting system as it was work as it did and hope that things worked out. But I've become more empowered since then. And I have involved coworkers, but I do it ahead of time and introduce them to the interpreters to let them know if you happen to make a mistake, if something is about my comments aren't being represented well, they might take over to do the interpretation into English. Now, whether or not that's always going to be an effective solution, I don't know, but it's one that I learned from another deaf person, Larry Fleischer. And I offer that to you as food for thought. As I mentioned earlier, a hearing presenter will typically turn to the interpreter and ask if they're going too quickly for the interpreter. And the interpreter might respond that the speaker is not going too fast for them because they can keep up. What they should say is, although I feel like I'm keeping up, I'm not sure if the pace is effective for the deaf participant. They should involve the deaf participant in that brief conversation to let them know that the pace really could be improved from their perspective. Often deaf people, even when offered that opportunity, don't want to rock the boat, and they just accept things as they are. But we have to learn to speak up for what we need. We have to speak up for what counts as appropriate access for us in interpreted meetings. Maybe we need them to slow down, even though the interpreter feels they're keeping up. The whole idea of feeling like you're going on a blind date when you show up someplace not knowing who's going to interpret for you, that's simply not acceptable. Why have we let that persist over the years? Interpreting agencies must change their practices such that when an interpreter is assigned, at the very least, that person's name is provided to the deaf participant. Also, the practice of having interpreter requests going out as a blast to any interpreter and have the interpreter assigned on a first come, first come, first served basis has to be changed. The quality of interpreters, the experience level of interpreters varies greatly, and that has to be taken into consideration when requests go out. Interpreting agencies have to take more accountability in that regard. Perhaps they can ask the deaf person what their preferences are. The deaf person may say, I will only accept certified interpreters. Or they may say, certification is not so important to me as having people that I know. Others may say, I just need to have somebody. The point is, the deaf person needs to be asked. Post-appointment confirmation. That's when you're walking out with the interpreter and there was something you weren't sure you caught and you check with the interpreter, say when the follow-up appointment's going to be, and the interpreter simply says, I can't answer that. That is not a deaf-centered response. During the appointment, a deaf person can be very overwhelmed and nervous and not in the state of mind to ask for clarification. When they ask afterward, and if you, the interpreter, know the answer, answer them. Don't simply respond that it's not your job, because that's not a deaf-centered way to respond. It's not sensitive to what the deaf person's experience is in such an environment where they have to rely on interpretation. Again, food for thought. The selection of interpreters. Who should make those selections? Also, how should feedback be given? Who tells the interpreter if they were effective or not, whether they should have been assigned or not? We need to have something like a Yelp for interpreters, so we can give ratings, 3.5 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5. And those ratings should be made public so that when a deaf person is appropriately informed of who their interpreter will be, they can look them up. Some not so qualified interpreters, though, are allowed to have lengthy careers without there being something like that in place, without some sort of formalized feedback mechanism. We need more of that. Next slide, please. Actually, go back one. This will do. Okay. In this slide, we see images of what we strive to have when the interpreting services provided absolutely meet our needs. And when the interpreters feel like they have completely met the needs of the deaf consumers, when everyone feels they've had a successful experience, no one feels disengaged or disheartened. I think we all agree that this represents what we want. And that the way that interpreters do their work must be deaf-centered. I hope that my presentation and the examples that I've given you have provided you with food for thought, and that you'll think more about this, that you'll define for yourself what it is that you need and how to communicate that, what interpreting services look like when they completely engage you and provide you the access you want. If your preference is to not actually get involved and just take interpreting services as they come, well, that's your choice. But especially today, when more and more deaf people are moving up in the ranks of their professions, in the corporation, in an academic setting, in the college or university, deaf professionals cannot afford to give up their right to access through unsatisfactory interpreting. We need a deaf-centered approach that allows deaf people more control in order to get the access they need in any environment where they use interpreting services. I coined the term DEAM, D-E-A-M, which might puzzle you. What it stands for is, well, it comes from actually 3 different English words: deaf, dream, and team, which I put together to make DEAM. What that means is services where the interpreter understands the deaf consumer's needs, the consumer understands the interpreters, and as a result, we get the responses as shown here in these images. The deaf consumers are happy, the interpreters are happy, and that's the goal that we all have. Over the next coming years, we are going to be gathering more and more information and ideas about how we might better train interpreters from a deaf-centered perspective, so that when we as deaf people enter hearing environments for whatever our reasons with interpreting services, we will have a peak experience. Please take some time to think more about this so that we can raise the bar and improve the standards of the interpreting profession. We need more and we expect more. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Watching your presentation makes me feel like it is time for us. It's time for the center to belong to us. We're the ones who are participating and having to listen to any presentation or be in any meeting. We need to be taking control of that participation, not the interpreter, and not have the aligning or the alignment be between the presenter and the interpreter. So yeah, we need to rock this situation and turn it around so that it's focused on us. I completely agree 100, 110, 120% with everything you've said. We do have a long list of questions for you. You won't believe how many questions we've got. But we'd like to actually start with the first question. And actually would like you to, we are asking the person if they want me to copy sign it. So it says, honestly, I love interpreting uh, whenever I go to any webinar or class. However, interpreters don't always meet my needs as a POC. How can this be resolved?
That's a very good question. The term deaf-centered, if we don't really examine it, might turn out to be white-centered. So that's why we have to include that as what we mean by deaf-centered. Typically, the teachers and interpreter programs are white. In order for something to be truly deaf-centered, it has to reflect the reality of the entire deaf community, all deaf people's lives. What is considered centered for deaf women might be different than from deaf men. What is considered centered for deaf people of color is going to have will have characteristics that meet the needs of people of color. The point of my presentation is that we need to discuss more what it means to have interpreter training that is deaf-centered in the full sense of the deaf community. We haven't discussed this in any great detail amongst ourselves even, so we need to get that feedback. We need to know in the full range of the deaf community what the full definition of deaf-centered might be so that all members of our community feel better served by interpreting services. In order to resolve the problems that we see, we have to base it on more information.
Totally agreed. I can think of an example of for myself. Let's say I want to host a workshop or host a webinar, and I'm seeking presenters for that. I always ask the presenter, are there any specific interpreters that you like to work with or specific captioners? I always ask that question because I I know that the presenter is providing that information to the community and that they're responsible for that and that the audience needs to receive that information in a very clear way. So that's why I always ask from the beginning, I ask the presenter is if we're going to host any workshop at all for CAD. So that's the one thing we're doing. So now I'm wondering, what about other situations like doctor's appointments and meetings? How can the deaf person mandate or request particular interpreters? How can that happen?
Well, they certainly should be able to. There's usually an agency involved, and the agency should be accountable for that. They should always make sure that they've matched the interpreter to the deaf person. But if it's just a matter of clicking on send and sending a request out to any and all interpreters on their roster, that's not acceptable. And then when an interpreter is selected, the deaf person should be given their name and perhaps some background information as well. Perhaps the deaf person will see that that interpreter will not be a good match for them at all, and they have the right to request someone else.
Yeah. Well, maybe how can we resolve this? Perhaps might be. Well, that is my question. How do we get this information out to the community, to or to all these interpreter agencies that they need to start taking this responsibility? That they need to start providing more information about who the interpreters will be and give deaf consumers a choice that they can have a voice in who their interpreter will be. Often it means someone in the company they're working for has to sign off on this, and perhaps the company's chosen interpreter isn't someone they want. What do we do about that situation?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, this needs to lead to some standard practices because the ones that have been standard are not satisfactory. We have to raise the bar.
But
The
how do
question
we
is
do
how,
that?
right?
Yeah.
How? It has to begin with our deaf community itself. We have to talk to each other. Then institutions have to take accountability. Agencies, the RID, we have to train ourselves to be more proactive when we make an appointment, to ask who the interpreter is going to be. And if we don't know who it is when the name is given to us, to ask for some background information. Perhaps it has to actually begin with us training ourselves to expect more than to simply acquiesce to whatever services are provided.
Yes. This is a question we really need to start looking at and creating a dialogue over. It's really time for the whole community to start this dialogue. Well, next question, question number 2. The question is, when the presenter asks the interpreter if they're speaking too fast, and the interpreter says, "Oh, I can keep up," and the interpreter doesn't ask the deaf person if it's too fast for them, that sort of situation, how do we prevent that from happening?
A couple of things come to mind. One is that interpreters haven't had sensitivity training. They've been trained to listen fast and sign faster. They have to start thinking differently. They're being able to sign all the signs, but as fast as they can, doesn't necessarily serve the deaf person. That should not be their goal to simply keep up. They're conveying meaning, not just words. That has to happen through dialogue with the deaf consumer. Ask the deaf consumer if they want to receive the message as fast as it's coming through, or do they want to receive it in a little bit slower pace? Do they want the interpreter to work a little bit more consecutively? And that'll be a new thing for interpreters because they're used to keeping up. And secondly, the interpreter doesn't show, well, they aren't trained to be sensitive when they simply answer the question asked by the hearing speaker based on their own experience. Because what's fine to the interpreter might not be fine with me. But most deaf people have been accustomed to remaining passive in those situations because we don't know what else we can do. So first it's about interpreter training, and it's about us getting better training amongst ourselves as well.
Another factor to consider, to be looked at, is perhaps, around the deaf person being passive. I mean, that is one thing, but there may be, some intimidation involved. They may not want to intrude on the other members of the audience. They want to blend into the other audience members, and 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 so that may be another factor to look at, is that the audience isn't aware of the deaf person's right, and the deaf person doesn't want to call attention to it, perhaps. Otherwise, another thing is the deaf person doesn't know the appropriate time. They don't know when is a good moment to bring up these issues, whether it has to happen during the moment when the fast pace is going on, or whether they should wait till afterwards. They don't have that sense of that. So perhaps that's why a deaf person is hesitant to bring it up. We need to remove that anxiety they have or that fear they have over it, and really emphasize to them that they have the right to participate fully equally, just like everyone else does. I don't know if there's anything there in the training that can get at this. Do you provide training for that? Do you provide workshops on this?
Well, you're right on there. I'll admit that I also have felt intimidated in an otherwise hearing environment. If I'm the only deaf person, yeah, that's tough. I totally get that feeling. So again, two things come to mind. One is on the part of the deaf-centered interpreter. We have to train interpreters to have a heightened sensitivity in those situations. It's not easy for deaf people to speak up. They need the interpreter to go more than halfway in working with the deaf person. And then we, as the deaf people, have to empower ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, the example that I learned from Larry Fleischer, he was someone that I greatly looked up to. And so that he would have something so new, such a new approach, was was life-changing for me. We need to find our own inspiration to do things differently and not just simply accept the status quo.
That's great. Well, moving on to question number 3. Often hearing people can click the audio to review the lecture or whatever the professor is saying, while we deaf people don't have access to that. We only have or we're not allowed to have a video recording. Interpreters don't like having themselves video recorded. So what do we do in a situation where the interpreter is refusing to be on camera? Has that ever happened, and what do we do about that?
Once again, that's an example of how much interpreters control the situation. They decide if they want to be recorded on camera or not. But yes, that does result in oppression of deaf people. That's why we need our deaf Yelp. If interpreters refuse to be videoed when otherwise other recordings are happening, other deaf people need to know about that. These experiences have to be discussed openly, and reviews must be shared openly, not to destroy an interpreter's reputation, but to enhance the level of accountability.
Right. Help them improve.
Exactly. If they're that self-conscious about being recorded, perhaps they're not ready to join the profession.
Hmm.
Also, I always appreciate hearing signers signing during the meeting and letting the interpreters interpret their signs into spoken English. Because that way I have direct communication with the hearing signer, talking about when they sign without using their voice. That gives me direct access rather than having to rely on interpreters the whole time. I feel like they're honoring me by communicating with me directly. But often I've had interpreters that refuse to interpret from a hearing signer. They'll only interpret deaf people's comments from ASL into English. Why would that be? Again, it's an example of the interpreter exerting too much control and limiting deaf people's access. We crave direct access with anybody who signs well enough to make that happen, rather than always relying on the interpreter. The point is that interpreters and hearing people in general have too much control over how interpreting happens, and that's not what we mean by deaf-centered interpreting.
That's something we really need to think about, how to stop that from happening. Definitely something to think about. Okay, question number 4. Interpreters still follow that standard rule of 20 or 30-minute intervals for switching. And this may not fit the deaf person's need. It may not be deaf-centered. Is that rule really a requirement? Is that set in stone somewhere that they must switch every 20 or 30 minutes? Is that some kind of strict policy that can't be violated?
It is not a policy, but it has become the practice.
Mm,
But where did that even come from? I actually did do some research on that. And there has been research finding that once interpreters work past 20 minutes, they do start to exhibit more errors in their product. I completely understand that. That makes sense. But what research is there on the effect of deaf people having the interpreter switch every 20 minutes? It can take us a good 10 minutes to get used to an interpreter when they start. That leaves us only 10 minutes before the next one starts in, and we have to start another 10-minute warming up period. Perhaps we have all this work done on the experience that interpreters have in their work, but not the experience deaf people have in using interpreting services. I get that interpreting is fatiguing and that there needs to be some solution, but perhaps the solution can be something different than a strict switching on and off every 20 minutes. Perhaps if the interpreters are both seated in view of the deaf person, they can divide the labor in a different way so that it's not so strenuous throughout, and that 20 minutes of work isn't as strenuous as it might have been otherwise. Can we try that? Currently, an interpreter is extremely busy for their 20-minute shift, and so of course they get worn out. Can we do it differently? Can we divide the labor differently? The point to your question, though, is that it's not a policy, but it has become the practice to the convenience of the hearing interpreters. But there might be other solutions, such as having both interpreters in view of the deaf person and dividing the labor in a way that makes it less arduous throughout.
Wow, more things to think about. And I do hope that some of you out in the community, perhaps, or you, Tom, could survey the community more and ask them what sort of practices they like. So some food for thought for further work for you. Next question. You mentioned during your talk the possibility of having a pre-meeting, or no, you were saying in order to that frequently your ally will avoid providing feedback around the working interpreter's mistakes, and so to avoid that awkwardness you might have a pre-meeting where you sort of negotiate and warm up to the interpreter with your ally and say, my ally is going to be here for this. Well, now a lot of us don't have the advantage of or the luxury of having that pre-meeting to come up with terms on how we're going to work together. How can we kind of seize the moment and be able to have that sort of meeting before a seminar or a workshop or something starts in those few minutes before? How can you maximize that time? Because some people, they're not able to have a pre-meeting. So what could they do just in those minutes before?
Well, first of all, I agree that not all meetings are going to have an ally present. Sometimes I'm on my own in a meeting, and then I just have to do the best I can. But I may have some hearing friends there, and that is a different story. But I am having more and more pre-meetings since I realized that was a good strategy, and it's been very effective. And as you say, it's not always feasible. But often when people do have pre-meetings, they don't think to include an ally, and I strongly recommend you do that. If there's going to be somebody who might want to provide support to the interpreters during the session while I'm presenting, they need to meet that person ahead of time. So that person will feel they have more permission to support or to even take over. It works out so much better if the interpreters know that that's a resource for them rather than having it sprung on them while they're working, and then it can become a power struggle. You have to have clear terms established on how support will be provided. Now, if there's no opportunity for a pre-meeting and yet there is an ally present, maybe you can follow Larry Fleischer's model, where you begin the talk saying that I will be presenting and I'd like to have so-and-so interpret my comments into English while the assigned interpreters will sign to me. We don't want to instill discomfort on the part of the working interpreters, but then I also have to be able to defend my own position. Because my ally there, as well as me, are part of that team, the Deaf Dream Team that includes the interpreters as well. That way we all feel that we're available for each other, and the interpreting service is provided in a much more effective way.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, and we do need to have our allies involved in that way. I agree. Now, question number 6. Like you said, deaf people need to start taking responsibility to let interpreters and agencies know their expectations and know their preferences before they submit a request. First of all, should that happen?
Again, we're dealing with entrenched standard practices where a request goes out from some department somewhere to an interpreting agency, and typically the deaf person has no input. So my
But
point is that standard practices have to change.
but how? How do they? What's the best way to make that change?
Well, first, the system has to change, meaning that agencies, the RID, what have you, all have to deal with this and take accountability. Deaf people have to take accountability as well by speaking out more. If they know they're going someplace where there's going to be an interpreter, take it upon yourself to find out who it's going to be. Let them know that you haven't gotten any information. If it's the doctor that made the request, reach out to the doctor first. If you know who the agency is, reach out to them. We have to become a lot more assertive in asserting the rights that we do have to get the services that need. We have to be ready to make a little noise and shake up the standard practices. I mean, I'm one of those who, for a long time, didn't rock the boat, but that's no longer acceptable.
Well, that's another one of, speaking for me personally, my experience is when I may point out to a company or to an agency that I have my list of or preferred agencies or interpreters, and I will tell the company, anytime you communicate with those agencies or interpreters, you need to CC me,
That's spot on.
right? Because I want to know who they're contacting and I want to confirm on the choices they're making, instead of having them just do this without any of my knowledge or any of my participation. So that's one thing. Second thing is, when they do submit a request, I'd like to see the particulars. I'd like to see what they've said so that I might step in and clarify some things or add some things if I need to. So those are two bits from my experience that maybe more deaf people could start doing to take more responsibility for the services they're getting. Demand to be included, CC'd on everything. You have to.
I'm just learning that from you now, Kavita. I was floored by that, but it's such a simple solution. Ask them to CC you, and I never thought of that
Yeah,
myself.
as simple as that.
See, this is the kind of dialogue we need to be having as deaf people to share the solutions that we have. I've shared what I learned from Larry. Now I'm learning from you. But what a simple solution. It's been right there, but I've never seen it. Because we as deaf people often don't know what our options are. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's a great
Sure,
tip.
my pleasure. Okay, next question, question number 7. Now, sharing the names of interpreters, you have to take into consideration the close-knit nature of the deaf community and the interpreting community. So there may be issues of safety. So the consumer should have an opportunity to not use a particular interpreter if they've got some safety issues with that interpreter, let's say. So how do we get the interpreting community and the deaf community together on sort of this sort of policy to let agencies know when they might need to switch out interpreters?
Well, my response to that is that today, everything's on the internet. We have ratings of doctors, we have ratings of restaurants, we have ratings of plumbers, we have ratings of dentists. Feedback is provided on every service you can think of, except interpreting. For some reason, that's the last taboo. We're going to hurt the interpreter's feelings. Deaf people don't know how to rate interpreting. And yet, those of us who aren't in all these other professions manage to give our ratings of their work. So that argument doesn't hold water.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I mean that is so true. That is so true. Definitely. Well, I hope
Uh,
people who are watching us are gonna start doing this more.
but don't forget, we'll also be posting about how effective the good interpreters are and this whatever deaf Yelp or whatever it is. And so those interpreters will be have a chance to work with more deaf people.
That's true. So, next question, question number 8. While some interpreters do strictly follow the code of ethics, I notice that there are some who do not. And so I'm wondering, do deaf people even know what these codes of ethics are and how they're taught? What are they taught about the interpreter code of ethics? How can we educate the community about that?
That's a very good question. The interpreters study their code of ethics. They know it back and forth, and yet we as deaf consumers have no clue. We don't know if they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, at least according to their code of ethics. We know the requested interpreters are certified, but certified interpreters aren't always sufficient. And we don't even always get certified interpreters. As deaf people, we often don't know what our recourse is, how we could file a complaint, how we could address the interpreter directly. We have no idea. It's a bind that we're consistently caught in because we are consistently disempowered. Now, whether or not we're educated on interpreters' ethics, well, I come back to the idea of a deaf Yelp. I'm not responding to the restaurant's legal situation and if whether they're up to code. I'm just responding to whether the food was good. Same way with restaurant
It's about, did I
interpreters.
get good service, right?
Exactly. What was their attitude like? How did it land on me?
I agree. So I guess that means you out there in the community who are really great at developing something like a Yelp for us or some kind of an app that we could use with regard to rating our interpreting services. Go for it. I think that's a great idea. I agree with you.
There are a few deaf-centered agencies out there, so that's already happening, where they solicit feedback from deaf consumers about interpreters. That's out there, but
Wonderful.
but it's not widespread. Also, I believe that when interpreters appear on an assignment, they should provide a business card with their name, the agency that sent them, and a way to provide feedback. As it is now, without that, I might have forgotten the interpreter's name. I don't know who sent them. I'd like to push that interpreters have appointment cards that they provide every time they show up with their name, the agency that sent them, and the method for providing feedback. I want to see that become a standard practice.
That's a great idea. Great idea. Now, you said some deaf agencies already have a deaf-centered approach. Can you tell us the names of those agencies? Can you provide that to us?
I can.
Great. And we'll post that on the CAD page. I'll make sure we do that to let the community know. I think that would be very nice. All right. Next question, number 9. So, for high risk situations such as court proceedings, interviews with law enforcement, interviews with Department of Child and Family Services, how can we as a community make sure that qualified interpreters are secured, with the deaf consumers being adequately prepared and knowing who is assigned, and that there's sufficient oversight in those settings to ensure that the deaf person is getting their access needs met? And if not, then making it known that that interpreter should not be hired again for that consumer or setting. So that's the question for you.
Wow, it's a very sensitive issue and a very important one. Over the past year, we have 2 court proceedings that were very publicly aired surrounding DeCara's legal issues. We were all very attentive to that. And then also the Maverick murder case. That also was made very public. And we saw the interpreting that happened. In these situations, the interpreters must accept accountability. There is a specialty certificate for working in legal settings, but that should include not whether they feel competent, but if they are adequate to the deaf people involved. That should become a standard practice. If it isn't, something needs to be done. One funny thing regarding DeCara's hearings, deaf people obviously were testifying in sign. The interpreters did not interpret simultaneously, they interpreted consecutively. So they would watch the deaf person and take notes, and when the deaf person was finished, they would deliver the interpretation in spoken English. And I assumed that that was being done well. I put my trust in them, but how did I know that? What did I base that on? One way to deal with that is that the other interpreter would back translate what the speaking interpreter says, so that the deaf person would have an opportunity to monitor the interpretation and correct it if need be. But without that, all you see is an interpreter speaking while the deaf person waits with no ability to follow what's happening or monitor it. So that's one example that could be improved.
Wow, that's great. You know, an example just happened to me a couple of weeks ago. You know, the Seattle bill, excuse me, a Senate bill that was being proposed to the government at the Capitol. And what shocked me was the interpreter was wearing a mask, and their eye gaze was directed downward at the floor. So they weren't even making eye contact with the deaf consumers. Their eye gaze was cast downward. They're wearing a mask, and they weren't even spelling the names of the people involved correctly. They were making a lot of errors. And this was the hearing person was a very highly placed individual. Uh, and I said to the to the interpreter, you need to let them know that I'm not satisfied with your services right now. And the interpreter refused to interpret that.
Oh no.
So, you know, I had to use my own voice and go up to the people involved and say, wait, you know, uh, this is a very important Senate hearing you're having on this bill that I'm very involved in. Uh, this is a very critical meeting for me. And so I had to spend a lot of time educating them about the quality of the services, and this interpreter didn't take it. So, I mean, that was my reaction is I think I'm going to sue. I think that's my next recourse is to sue.
That is recourse. Yes, I think you're right in that situation. I'd agree with you.
Okay, now for the last question. And this just goes to show you what a hot topic this has been. So, my last question. Can you explain your term DEAM, DEAM, in terms of your experience of interpreters adopting this model? DEAM.
Yes. Again, it stands for Deaf Dream Team. It's where the interpreters and I form a team together. We strategize how the interpreting will work and come up with different possibilities. As I said, I teach at Ohlone College, and the interpreters I work with there are very open to this type of suggestion. If I participate on a committee with hearing people, say colleges have lots of committees, I don't like just sitting back because the interpreting isn't allowing me full participation. I want to demonstrate to these hearing people how competent deaf people are. Maybe it has to do with tenure or promotion, or anyone who's seeking tenure or promotion has to be visible and speaking up at meetings like that. If a deaf person is just sitting back and not being able to get that hour and a half of their life back again, then that doesn't serve them. This idea of switching on and off every 20 minutes was just not meeting my needs. I couldn't, because it was all based on the clock. And the interpreter who was on was trying to do everything at once, and it was kind of frantic and hard for me to follow. So that's why I thought about having the second interpreter, rather than being in a feed role, sit also in my field of view so that I could see both of them and they could actually deliver something in more like a natural interactive style, the way that the hearing people were actually interacting. Another way is so that one person could sign and the other person is prepared on a moment's notice to jump in and interpret my comments, which is hard for one interpreter to do alone because interpreters lag by several seconds and they're trying to finish up what the first hearing person said before they interpret my comments, by which time a second hearing person has grabbed the floor. So this idea of interpreters working in this old standard way isn't working. And I need to do my job. I can't constantly be worried about the interpreting process. I can't be the one that's there to support the interpreters. I need them to support me in order to do my job and advance in my job. There are some meetings where the PowerPoints slides just are flying left and right, where they're referring to documents and they say, please look at line 5, and they speak while they're doing it. Sometimes one interpreter will sit next to me and direct my gaze to what part of the document's being referred to so that I don't have to go searching for it while the signing interpreter keeps on signing and I'm missing information. Is that the interpreter's job? Well, why can't it be? Rather than only being focused on their teammate and providing feeds where even the best feeds don't result in something that is effective for my participation. The interpreters at Ohlone are very experimental in nature. They've been very flexible. And I feel like we've been able to find strategies that are much more effective for me. I'm grateful to them for that. I don't have all the answers. They don't expect me to. They play with me. We experiment. That every 20-minute switching on and off is almost never what's effective any longer. And I understand, though, that one interpreter may not be able to handle a very fast-paced 40-minute presentation. I don't try to dictate to interpreters what they have to do to their detriment or to their discomfort. We work together as a team. And the interpreters that work with me in that manner have become friends. We're very close. And we respect each other. And that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be that the interpreters breeze in as the professionals and the ones who are going to handle how the works.
Well, I love that term, DEAM, DEAM, and thank you for explaining it and expanding on it. There's so many more questions we could be asking. Our time has run out, but perhaps this is something we could consider, perhaps asking you to provide a more in-depth workshop on this topic at some time, or provide
Certainly.
some training, some way that we can start to improve this situation. And it's Yes, yes, let's discuss it offline because our time has run out for now. So I want to thank everybody who's been involved, everyone who's attended tonight and attended the workshop. Perhaps you may be able to contact Tom directly or send your further questions to us and we can forward them to Tom for you and he might be able to answer them. So I would also like to thank our two interpreters, Aaron and Dan, who've been voicing for you this evening. And also our behind the scenes team, Ming Chen and Sharon Goff, those two who have been fielding the questions for us. And last but not least, our tech director of the whole platform, our CAD vice president, Jermaine Cornish, who was very ably directing the proceedings this evening. I also like to thank On the Air Productions for donating the platform that we're using this evening. They're a sponsor and someone who supported us in this all along. There are a lot of different topics out there, so if you have a particular thing that you're interested in, please email us with your interest, what you would like to see us discuss at these forums on the CAD, either on the CAD platform or as part of a workshop. So please also consider making a donation to support this effort. You can go to the CAD website and make your donation there. And don't forget to watch out for our upcoming events that will be appearing on this CAD platform in the near future. Good evening, and
Good
thank
evening,
you, Tom.
everyone.
Thanks, Tom.
Goodbye.
Good night, everyone. So long.